Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Correllian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, whatever platform you may be watching on, if you type your comments into that platform, they'll appear here in my chat room and we can communicate directly. And this is one of my favorite parts of this program. And this week, I thought we would talk about Correllian history, a little bit about the tradition's history, maybe a little bit about my history, a little bit about other people in the tradition, whatever conversation leads us to. And I wanted to start by pointing out that this coming Monday, 1 week from today, will be Labor Day, but also Correllian Founding Day, September 4th. And hello to Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. And that will also be the anniversary of the founding of Witch School. And we've done a lot of things, actually, historically, on September 4th. It's one of two particularly important days in the Correllian tradition, the other being November the 11th. And we've done a lot of things tied to one or the other of these days. This particular year, we're hoping to bring you quite a bit of remaining footage from the Parliament that you have not seen yet at this time a week from now. And we wanted to bring that to you then. And hello to Renee in the chat room. Hello to Antonio in the chat room. It's good to see you. And so watch for that coming. Hello to Sir Eric in the chat room. And I also want to take a moment to say that if you enjoy my work, if you would like to support my work, you can do so through my Patreon at revdonlewis.com, or perhaps by getting a reading at, from me through my email at donlewishp@aol.com, or by messaging me at Facebook or at Instagram. Hello to Rev Michael in the chat room. Or by perusing our products at Correllian.com. We are having a half-price sale through the rest of this week, as well as many other things that are at their normal prices. And there are many things to see there. And when we come back to Correllian Founding Day, this is the day that historically we have said that Correllian tradition was founded by Caroline High Correll. It's also her birthday. And hello to Mary in the chat room. And she founded it following a number of things that happened in the 1870s. We can argue about what we might call it. It was certainly a kind of witchcraft. One of the things you'll often hear in certain segments of the community is that nobody called themselves witch before the 1950s. That's actually not true in the United States. It might be true in Britain. I don't know about Britain. But here in the United States, there are actually quite a lot of people who did call themselves witches, particularly connected to the folklore movement, particularly in the late 19th century, and even going back toward the 18th century. It had a different meaning here. Whether the term cunning person was actually more common in the United Kingdom, I don't know for sure, but it really was not particularly well used here by comparison to witch, and people did use that term. What they meant by it is another question, and it depended on who you were talking to. And with the Correllian tradition, we did not use the term Wicca until the 1970s. We drew on a variety of different traditions. We drew on spiritualism. We drew on traditional witchcraft. We drew on universalism, and had connection with both the Universalist Church and also the Spiritualist Church. We had a lot of influence from Eastern traditions. And of course, in those years, it was a familial tradition. And hello to Lynn in the chat room. It's good to see you. One of the things about a familial tradition is that it does tend to be influenced by what the family members were doing. And that isn't necessarily always something that's thought out ahead of time. It's something that they choose to do. And each person added different things. And if you'd spoken to those people at that time, you might have found them doing different things. While at the same time having a basis to work from. Today, we have lots of written material. We have a lot of things to work with that they did not necessarily. And we also have standardized lessons, which they did not. And at one time, we thought this was a very important thing. And as far as I can see, it still is. Because it means that each of us have a certain beginning that we start from. But that beginning is not the ending. I often talk about how Lady Crystal, when I reached my third degree, said, this is not the end of your studies, it's the beginning. And you're going to go on to learn many other things. And this is also still true for us today. And hello to Angeline in the chat room. It's good to see you, Angeline. In talking about, and hello to Brian in the chat room. In talking about Corellian history this week, I will probably talk a little bit about older things, but I also want to talk about some of the more modern things. I want to talk about Corellianism in Chicago in the 1990s, for example, and moving into the early 2000s. I want to talk maybe about the early witch school years, maybe about the 1980s and what that held, and how each of these has been different in its own way. And it's worth noting that what I was just saying about how in earlier times, each family member would have their own practice starting from a certain shared point of view. And that certainly is still true for Corellians today. And for example, in the parliament that just happened, we got to meet Apu from the Philippines. Now, Apu, also known as Sir Rolando, the Reverend Sir Rolando, we've known for many years, but to actually meet him in person was a new thing. But in the Philippines, in particular, what Sir Rolando does is very strongly influenced by Philippine culture. There are other parts of our tradition that are influenced by individual cultures of the people who are doing it, or individual interests of the people who are doing it. And Brian says in the chat room, to meet him in person was an experience, and that was absolutely true. And it was wonderful to get to meet him. The whole parliament was wonderful, and once again, we're going to be bringing you additional footage from that on Corellian Founding Day, a week from now. And hello to Magical Mermaid. And Magical Mermaid says, and how technology has influenced the community or spiritual culture. Well, in a lot of ways, particularly in the last 30 years, really in the last 40 years, that's been the story of the Corellian tradition. I think more than anyone else, we have worked with technology, largely due to Sir Edward, also to some extent due to myself. We have in one way or another worked with technology in ways that has drastically changed things that we have done versus how we would have done them previously, and changed the audience that we're talking to. And one of the things that is very important to mention at present is that technology is changing again. And we're going to have to be on top of that if we want to go forward into the future. Now, Rev Eric says, a wonderful photograph captured the moment that Rev Rolando met and hugged Lord Don. This was my highlight of the Parliament. Yes, that was a wonderful photograph. I believe that Sir Arlene took that photograph. It was a wonderful photograph, and it really did capture that moment. And it really was a wonderful moment. And we also had Lady Rain come in from South Africa. That was wonderful to see her again. It was wonderful to see people from across the United States come in. We had really a wonderful time. And there's still a lot of material that we have not yet brought forward. And so, again, we're going to be bringing that forward to you here in the near future. We had the great good fortune of having a very large press corps at the Parliament. that did a lot of work. And this was very, very positive. Um, Going back to technology, we talked for a moment about the idea of universal test, well, not universal test scores, but universal lessons that all of our clergy now take. And that was not necessarily the case in the past. In the past, it was a much more individual education. Um, and, that could be both good and bad. And hello to Serenity in the chat room. And thank you, Serenity. I am doing well. Hello to Diggs in the chat room. It's good to see you. And we had Serenity with us at the Parliament as well. And among other things, she got the peace drum, which she has promised to bring to illustration in the spring. And that will be wonderful. And it was great to see Serenity. It was great to see everyone. But the idea of having universal lessons does give us all a certain thing that we start with. And in my point of view, that really became possible because of technology, certainly on the level that we use it. And when I go back and look at my life, most of the things that I did later came in handy in ways that were not always immediately obvious at that time. One of these was working in the pagan press. When it came time to do things like those universal lessons, when it came time to do witch rule, having that background, having studied commercial art right before it became basically a dead profession, but these both became very important skill sets for going forward in creating many of the things that we have. And Serenity says, I'm super excited to bring it. It's such a surreal gift. And that's very true. And Sir Eric says, without technology, I would not be a Corellian. And that's true, I think, for everyone watching this. Prior to prior to 2000, prior to the foundation of witch rule, we were a small tradition. We were not the smallest in the world, but we were a small tradition even after having chosen to become a public tradition. And we mostly had people only in Illinois. And we were mostly working on the ground. And there's a lot to be said for working on the ground, and it was always our intention that the technology would later make it possible for other people to work on the ground. And I think that we're back at that point for many people now. But with that technology, we've been able to reach so many people all over the world. We mentioned Sir Apu from the Philippines. We mentioned Lady Rain from South Africa. Without the technology, many of these places where there is a lot of Corellianism now would not currently exist. They took shape because we had a way to reach them. And it was, and hello to Ardigia May in the chat room. It's good to see you. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. It's very good to get to see you. And it's good for me to see everyone here. I love seeing all of you, and I love getting to work with all of you. And that is part of this technology issue also. And Ardigia May says, you can call me Dee Dee. I will do that. And it says it was close though, so very good. So it's good to see Dee Dee in the chat room. And because we've used this technology, we've gone around the world. And when we come to Corellian Founding Day, which is September 4th, we want to remember that we're no longer just an American tradition. We have people all over the world. We have people in places that, I don't know that we really would have seen it when we were younger. Um, I mean, we kind of did and we hoped for it, but, to actually see it is such a thing. Um, of course, Lady Crystal has said if she had actually believed some of the things the ancestors were saying back in the 70s and the 80s, she would have run screaming into the hills. Um, Her attitude at the time was, well, let's see what happens. And it actually did happen, which has been quite a thing. And it's interesting to watch as that continues to develop. And for me now, being retired, that's going to be even more interesting. And I am very glad to see the younger generation step up. Um, and all of these different things are part of what we celebrate on Corellian Founding Day. They're part of what we look at. This particular year, we wanted to celebrate how we did at Parliament. And how did we do? Well, at the end of 30 some years, we found ourselves on the opening stage. That is a heck of a thing for us. I know there are some people, I've often heard people say, what do numbers matter? Well, if you watch the film Journey to the Parliament, you'll know right in the first few minutes why numbers matter. Numbers are what determine if the rest of the world sees us as a religion or not. You can claim rights all you want, having 10 people meeting in your living room, but actually getting them can be another matter. The only reason that some of those small groups are able to have some of the rights they have is larger organizations that stood up for them. Without those larger organizations, without having that place on the world stage, I don't know that we would be able to keep those rights. Rights are not something that can be given to you. You either have to be able to hold them or you can't. And if you can't hold them, they're not rights at all, they're privileges. And again, if you watch Journey to the Parliament, you saw that word used also. That back in 93, our presence as pagans of all different kinds at the Parliament was considered a privilege that they were bending over backwards to give us, because we did not meet what they regarded as their definition of religion, according to, for example, the UN or any other major body on earth. It was necessary at that time to take us all together in order to do that. It's not necessary now. And Sir Eric says there are still plenty of pagans and witch covens who desire to remain in the broom closet, and that's certainly true. But on the other hand, without the larger groups, that may be the only choice they would have. As it is, they can make different choices. And when it was time for the Pentacle Quest, it was the fact that there were larger groups able to do that that made that possible. It was not the individuals who wanted to have the pentacle on their tombstone in VA cemeteries. They were not able to make it happen. It was groups like the ATC and Circle Sanctuary that made it happen. And had those groups not been there, who knows what would have happened? Maybe when the administration changed, something would have happened. Who knows? But I don't know that I would have held my breath for that. It's the fact that there were people able to create a ground roots movement, a national movement, and to appeal to actual politicians that made the difference. And when we look at something like the Parliament, that's one of the reasons to be there. I've heard, again, people say, in fact, a very close friend of mine, the Archpriestess Dina from the Fellowship of Isis, once made this same comment: why do numbers matter? But it was numbers that got Olivia onto that 8-person council in 1993 at the second convening of the Parliament. At that time, the Fellowship of Isis was the largest goddess worshipping community in the world, and their numbers made a lot of difference toward getting pagans at that Parliament. Um, our numbers today make a lot of difference toward having pagans represented in the material world. Some years ago, there was an attempt to do a pagan um, credit union. And, we were able to write a letter as a church, which alone provided the numbers that allowed them to do that. I don't believe they actually did it, but that's beside the point. And hello to Rev Calvin in the chat room. It's good to see you, Rev Calvin. And so when we come back to Correllian Family Day, all these things are part of what we're celebrating. And again, being pagan is a personal path, but being part of a tradition is also a group path. And I think that for us, we celebrate both of these things. We have never suggested, and certainly would not suggest, that anyone should not be following their individual path, not at all. But we do feel that that group path is also important, and these are some of those reasons. And a lot of this does go back to Correllianism in Chicago in the 1990s. And many of the things we learned there, including our first experiences with that Parliament, our experiences with that first pagan hosting committee for the Parliament that you have never heard of, but perhaps we will talk about tomorrow. Our experiences working with the Pagan Leadership Conference that, if you've heard of from me most likely. But it was a valuable education. And so many other things that really taught us how to work in that sort of larger group. And, I'd like to say that I always had the answers for that. Sir Edward had many of the answers for that, and I had some of them. But, I can remember back in the 90s being hopelessly naive about the pagan community. I possibly sometimes still am. But then there were things I was terribly naive about. And Dee Dee says, I absolutely love your wisdom, Lord Don. Well, that's very nice of you. It's nice that we have technology, as you stated, because it makes sitting at the feet or at the table with our elders possible. And this is how memories will be made for many of us. Thank you, Dee Dee. And, that's true. If you go back to the 80s or even much of the 90s, and even a little beyond that, really considerably beyond that, if you wanted to hear from your elders, for want of a better way to put it, you had to go to a festival. That's where they were likely to be. They weren't doing broadcasts for the most part. For the most part, that wasn't possible yet. They might be doing a radio show somewhere, maybe. They might be doing a magazine. In some cases, that was more common. Also depends who you considered your elders. If you're talking about just people who write books, who many do regard as elders, they weren't, for the most part, doing anything but writing their books and appearing at festivals. And this is one of the things that made festivals so important in those days. And of course, they still are now. But as we look at what technology has done for us, you can be here talking to me every day. Minus occasional days that for one reason or another I'm not here for, but generally speaking for every day. And that is going to continue, I believe, for quite some time. And there are a lot of things to be said You can do this with other elders in the community who are doing the same thing. Um, Although I would argue that at this point, I'm still probably the most recorded of all pagan leaders, because I've chosen to make that a thing in my life. And Dee Dee says this is how memories will be made for many of us. It's true. Um, and I'm hoping that we will at some point have more of an occasion where we'll actually bring people on to talk in person. Um, Although that might be a different show. We'll see what happens. But technology is only advancing. And what it's going to make possible for us is also only going to advance. One of the things I would like to see as we go forward in just this next few years, and you're already starting to see it, is virtual reality, where we have, for want of a better way to put it, a kind of astral temple we can all go to. And you might say, well, that's not the same as an astral temple, but I think we may find when we're using them that yes, they kind of are. It really depends on how much you go into trance when you go to that sort of situation. I don't see any reason you couldn't. Now, Sir Eric says, in the 90s when I was with Paul, I lived close to the leadership, and I said I had a luxury of proximity to be able to grok their wisdom. If you're not familiar with the term grok, it means to completely understand. I used that word the other day, but I haven't heard it in some time. Now I can tune into Midday with Rev Don every day. And this is exactly the point I was trying to make. Yes, and exactly the point Dee Dee was making. In the 90s, when Eric was involved with CAW, living close to the leadership was a luxury of proximity. It meant you could actually speak to them, actually hear their direct ideas in a way that you didn't otherwise. And that isn't true today. Today, we can all be on talking to you frequently. And that, it does sometimes leave me when I'm looking at my day saying, what am I going to talk about today? But generally speaking, I think this is a huge change that technology has made for us. So once again, I want to emphasize that 1 week from today, on September 4th, which is Corellian Founding Day, and also this year Labor Day, and also the Witch School anniversary, we'll be bringing you more video from Parliament, and it's going to be quite a show. And we have one last comment. Dee Dee says, like, I truly believe it's still important to strive to be at events in person as often as financially and rationally possible. Very important points. The power raised together in person is just amazing, and it is. But that doesn't mean that it's less potent via Zoom or other platforms. It's why I love our tradition and the ability to create study group shrines and everyday temples. It allows those local and global spaces to ebb and flow. And this is exactly so. And I think it's one of the great strengths of our tradition, that we have the online presence, and in many places we have that physical presence as well. And with that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour, and I'm going to close with our prayer, as I normally do, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to help us to find the balance that exists between technology and everyday life. Help us to find that balance just as our ancestors found it at the time of the agricultural revolution, at the time of the invention of the printing press, at the time of the Industrial Revolution. These have always been times when humanity has had to adjust itself, to learn new things, but always they have brought us new things that have made our lives easier. We ask you to help us to find for ourselves that balance, and for our tradition that balance. And Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for everything that you do in our lives. And we thank you knowing you are always with us, but from respect for your presence here today and all times in our lives, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. Um, and I love you all. And may you all have a wonderful day. And I'll see you tomorrow.